Thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask whoever is joining us tonight if you could please share this show on whatever platform you're using on social media, be it Twitter, be it Instagram, be it Facebook, WhatsApp groups. We'd appreciate it. We'll reach a lot more people. We have an important message to get across tonight. We're talking about the protests that are going on in Israel right now, the civil unrest. There was tens of thousands of Israelis demonstrating in Tel Aviv just after the brutal murder, the terrorist attack in Jerusalem, where Jewish children were murdered in cold blood. And there's celebrations that are going on by supporters of the PLO, by supporters of the PA throughout Judea and Samaria. In Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, there's celebrations going on there. And in spite of that, there are these protests going on against the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, extolling the so-called virtues of democracy, led by the extreme left, led by people such as Yair Lapid, who there's been reports that his wife is a member of Jews for Jesus, or one of those types of organizations. Protests led by Ehud Olmert, a former prime minister of Israel, who's calling for a civil war. It's getting vicious out there. And we're going to be discussing this issue tonight. I have with me Meir Jolovitz, who we've certainly had on many times before, and he's going to dissect what is going on and explain to our viewers, to our supporters, exactly what's going on. Without further ado, Meir, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mayor. Apologize in advance for my voice. And it's not because I was at a demonstration in Jerusalem against the democratically and legitimate government that now has a coalition that rules. It's rather remarkable, actually, just by way of footnote, that when the last coalition government was put together, the first piece of it, which was under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and then he handed over the reins to then caretaker Prime Minister Yair Lapid, the fact that they were ruling with 60 and then 60 in a coalition, that seemed not to trouble the leftists either in Israel or elsewhere. And I mentioned or elsewhere because I will bring that up later in conversation. It's important. The fact that there was an Arab element that was included for the first time as part of the coalition government also didn't seem to trouble those people who pretend that they're Zionists when it's necessary for them to wave that banner. But all of a sudden you have a fair election by all the rules of democracy. Israel now has a coalition government of 64. It's a strong coalition government. It includes no Arab element, no Arab parties. And yet all of a sudden, the very people who thought that the previous government was legitimate, and it wasn't fully legitimate, all of a sudden they're complaining. And it comes down to something which I'm sure will be a common theme throughout our discussion day, and that is there's a war going on, and it's a war of ideas. And the reality is it's more of the anti-Bibi sentiment. Everything that we see fashioned today, the election that we had on November 1st of 2022, 3.5 months ago, was basically a referendum for the Likud party more than any other party. And when one looks at the numbers, Likud, for example, got about 24% of the vote. And therefore, they had the largest numbers. With the coalition pieces that they put together, they've got this government, and it rules effectively. But the left won't have it. Chief among the leftist voices screaming in opposition, for example, is the Meretz party, which failed to even cross the threshold. They got 3.16% of the vote. They couldn't even get elected into the Knesset. They had 1/8 as many people voting for them as they had for Likud, and yet Meretz, which couldn't make the government, calls the present government an illegitimate government. And we realize that we're truly living in an Orwellian world. Others might say it's a twilight zone. But we need to take stock and simply say that it just seems to be inconvenient for them. And the fact that Bibi Netanyahu, Likud, and his partners, we're talking about four actual parties, religious, traditional, and Zionist. The fact that they now rule Israel has been a problem for the left, enough that the liberal left is now complaining, not only in Israel, as we've seen in the demonstrations that you've mentioned, but by demonstrations all over the world, that the present Israeli government is illegitimate. What's illegitimate is their protest of what really was a truly democratic election.
I watched just a couple nights ago, Motzi Ratz from the Meretz Party. He was interviewed on I-24 News, and he makes it very clear. He justifies the terrorism that has been sweeping Israel, and the most recent attack just before Shabbat in Jerusalem. And he says it's because of the so-called occupation, and his solution to this is that Israel should just open up the country and allow the Arabs, wherever they are, in Judea and Samaria, and in East Jerusalem, the right to vote, one person, one vote. He has no problem with these people who are giving out cake and candy and pastries, celebrating the murder of Jews and chanting support for terrorists and chanting Khyber Yehud. That he wants to give his interpretation of democracy is that those people who support the murder of Jews should be accorded unbelievable rights, and the Jews should just shut up and let that happen and be stepped on again and again and again, because the idea of a Jewish state is horrible to him. But he has no problem with Arab countries that surround Israel, that are defined as Arab countries or defined as Islamic countries. When you hear this, and he was part of that coalition government by Yair Lapid, and Naftali Bennett propped him up and had no problem giving him powers in that coalition government. And Motzi Ratz is leading people from the left onto the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities in Israel to be part of these so-called pro-democracy protests. Meir, I want to hear what you have to say about someone such as Motzi Ratz and the others that are coming out and dictating and saying what democracy is and that Jewish is horrible.
You've actually laid a good foundation. I'm going to mention just very quickly, I've done this in a previous podcast. I understand also that there are certainly many viewers out there who might not have always been privy to the conversations that we've had before. But in light of what you've just said, I just need to bring back to light a certain fact, which is quite troubling. In Israel, when parties run for the Knesset, there are four elements which are considered disqualifiers. Disqualifiers, that if the party which is running ideologically supports any one of the four elements, which I'm going to mention ever so briefly, if the party supports any of the four, that party is ineligible, according to the rules of Israel's democracy, to be part of the Knesset, never mind part of a ruling coalition government. Those four elements, and you mentioned Raz, you mentioned Meretz. It's certainly true of Yair Lapid. It's true of Benny Gantz. It's true of anyone who's part of that last illegitimate coalition government. Illegitimate, I think, not as a matter of opinion, but on the basis of Israeli law. Those four elements, by the way, which are disqualified. One, if a party or an individual running as part of a party believes in negating the state of Israel as a state of the Jewish people, it's a disqualifier. They can't sit in the Knesset. Second disqualifier, negating the democratic nature of the state of Israel. Now, I will say by way of footnote, we just saw a democratically elected Benjamin Netanyahu Likud-led government. It was democratically elected. It is being denied by the opposition that we see in the streets today. They, in essence, are denying or negating the democratic nature of the state. They say it's not democratic because the other side won. The third element is incitement to racism. And the comments that have been made in the last week, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the brief time we have today, the incitement to racism has come from the left, and as it always has come from the Arab camp. That's a disqualifier for the Knesset. And the last one, and this applies to the Arab parties, support for the armed struggle against the state of Israel. Now, that has always been, the armed struggle is a euphemism, of course, for wars or terrorism against Israel. The Arab parties, the Arab politicians, every one of them that sits in the Knesset, basically supports incitement, supports the armed struggle against the Jewish state. They should be disqualified. What's remarkable is in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen a certain institutional insanity which has taken place in Israel, where 2 former prime ministers, Ehud Barak, referred to Bibi Netanyahu as, he compared him to Adolf Hitler. Another former prime minister, Ehud Olmert, talked about the need for civil war, talked about the fact that there needed to be bloodshed in order, enough talk, he said, enough talk, we need to act. And by act, he said bloodshed. And another almost prime minister, Benny Gantz, he came out and said that that circumstances require a war against the party that now rules in a coalition. So you're talking about 3 prominent politicians in Israel, a former prime minister, another former prime minister, and a former minister of defense, an almost prime minister, who actually called for warfare against a party that was democratically elected. And notwithstanding everything that I've just mentioned, it's remarkable that the element out there, not only in Israel, but in the New York Times, in BBC, in the European Union, they've all jumped on this bandwagon as to suggest that this present government, because it included Itamar Ben-Gvir, or because they want judicial reform, and they don't think that Israel should have a Supreme Court of judicial activists, all of a sudden that makes the Likud, that makes the present government, it makes all the others, those in government, they say illegitimate, and they try to legitimize the opposition against Israel. It is in every sense an Orwellian inversion of not only the truth, not only of logic, but also of any moral code that ought to drive any democracy.
When you mention Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, comparing Benjamin Netanyahu to Hitler, Jewish organizations throughout the world and the position of Israeli governments for a number of years already has been to support the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and to call on governments throughout the world to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and municipalities and school boards and campuses. And that was a big deal with President Donald Trump, in fact, that he accepted it and was going to penalize university campuses who were promoting anti-Semitism and terrorism against Jews. He was going to defund those campuses. So the IRA definition is very important. And in the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the examples are Nazi comparisons. When this is going on front and center with the protests that are going on against the government of Israel, that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak says that's in violation of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. That calls him someone who is promoting anti-Semitism, and anyone else who uses the same kind of language. And yet, the left wing in Israel, they don't pause for a moment and they don't want to accept that definition during these protests. Everything goes for them. This is outrageous. How do you see that?
Yeah, let me comment. Excuse me again. In many of my lectures, I've asked the question rhetorically, when Israel's government, particularly the previous one, when they do something which just isn't in Israel's best interest. The maritime agreement, for example, with Lebanon, which is a surrender of Israeli rights, Israeli territory, to Israel's enemies. In this particular case, to Hezbollah, to Iran. And the question I would ask rhetorically is, why is it that sometimes intelligent people say or do stupid things? And the answer that I would sort of give to that rhetorical question was, well, maybe they're not so intelligent. In this particular case, Meir, the names that you brought up, Ehud Barak, it isn't a case of they're not being intelligent. These are people, they know exactly what they're doing. They have an agenda. That agenda is to bring, as I mentioned, obliquely, to bring down this government. It's particularly to bring down Bibi Netanyahu, Likud. That is their mission. When someone says, why would they do something stupid? Because after all, their criticism of Israel actually is fodder for all the enemies of Israel, all of Israel's adversaries. They just quote Israel. Here it is, they're quoting former Israeli prime ministers that Israel is as Ehud Barak once said, it is virtually, he said, we're almost becoming an apartheid state. Right. My God, you want to talk about giving the enemy the tools necessary to go after Israel? This isn't something which is stupid. This is something which is done by design. The way that they justify it is also, it's so disingenuous. There was a piece that was written, I think it was in the Times of Israel, where someone did an analysis about this judicial reform. And if you wish, we can go into the details of what the judicial reform entails. I shouldn't say details, just an overview. But the judicial reform represents, of course, what this present government, this new coalition wants to do. And it's frowned upon by the left because it means that it'll take away the power that they had illegitimately held since 1992 and beyond, when the Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak came up with the various elements which should have been challenged at the time, and they weren't. But the piece that I'm referring to, someone, an intellectual, so-called intellectual, writes a piece and he says, actually, he said, the majority of Israel isn't the majority that's being served by the coalition government, which obviously has 64 seats in the Knesset. He said, and what he did is an analysis. I do the same analysis, but his conclusion was very different. What he said was, if you actually count the votes in the last election of those people who were eligible to vote, 70.5% of eligible Israelis actually voted. And what he said was that the camp that now makes up the coalition government got 2,305,000 votes. I rounded up by just 100 or so. Whereas the coalition that sits in opposition, as he puts it, actually had 22,000 more votes. That 2,327,000 votes together. And therefore, they were legitimately the Democratic choice. What he wasn't honest enough in doing was to let you know how many of those 2,322,000 votes, which were cast against the government that we see seated today, were Arab votes. The Arab votes, I did the math, the Arab votes were 511,000 and some odd change. 511,000. So if you exclude the Arabs, and I on purpose mentioned those disqualifiers, these are the Arab parties which were guilty of each of those four elements, which didn't even allow them to be eligible according to Israeli democratic law. If you eliminate those 511,000, then it isn't a close game as far as the popular vote. It isn't close at all. It is a landslide. If you look at the Jewish vote, and you see, did the Jewish vote for the government that now sits as the coalition government, or those that sit in opposition? It's a landslide on behalf of those that today sit as part of the Likud, the Bibi Netanyahu government. So this manipulation of numbers is so fraudulent, because what this person is saying is that we need to factor in the Arabs who don't recognize Israel's right to exist. And if you factor them, we actually have a slight majority. That's not the way Israeli government works. It's remarkable that this same intellectual, the pseudo-intellectual, had no problem with the last government. I'm talking about the Bennett-Lapid government coming into power, when in fact 731,000 votes had been cast by Israelis for what they thought was a right-wing or leaning right-wing ideology, and they turned, in a betrayal of the vote that they received, joined a leftist government. That these leftists, these intellectual academia, Israeli media, the BBC, they have no problem with that. What they have a problem with is a government in Israel which is Zionist, which is traditional, and which is proud of its heritage. That is the problem that they have. So, unlike the question that I would ask rhetorically, why would smart people do dumb things? They aren't dumb. They know exactly what they're doing. And permit me, I'm just going to grab the sheet of paper. 2 weeks ago, there were demonstrations in the following cities, this government, not about judicial reform, about the fact that this government was elected. There were demonstrations in Barcelona, in Berlin, in Boston, in Cambridge, UK, in Chicago, London, Los Angeles, Madrid, Miami, Munich, New York, Oslo, Paris, Rome, San Francisco, Seattle, Toronto, Vancouver, and Washington, D.C. Imagine, why is it the interest of someone in Seattle or Oslo or Madrid or Munich, the fact that there was a democratically elected government which in Israel, which they don't like, and they receive the publicity? We need to basically understand that this is the enemy, and we need to do what we need to do. In Israel today, the news came out that Yariv Levin, who's Israel's Minister of Justice, who is steadfast in his determination to bring this judicial reform, to stop the judicial activism, the judicial revolution, as it was called in 1992, when Aaron Barak sort of sneaked it in. The present Minister of Justice, Levin, thinks it should be stopped. Bibi Netanyahu, we're told, I don't know how credible, is actually at odds with him and said, let's buy some time, let's stall. The demonstrations don't look good for us. They don't ring well in the Western world. Maybe we can negotiate some kind of compromise. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, because Likud denies that happened. But the point that's being made by Levin is it's the right thing to do. We were elected by the Israelis, certainly by a large majority of the Jewish population of Israel. We will bring upon the type of judicial reform which will prevent the left from having this tyranny of the courts.
You know, Mayor, Israel is surrounded by Arab and Islamic countries. They are not so-called democracies. Jordan is a monarchy. Egypt, I think it was a coup that took place. Throughout the Arab world, these countries are either monarchies, dictatorships. They have strict citizenship laws, who could become a citizen in their countries, who will be able to vote in their countries. And somehow Israel is held on a pinnacle, and the finger is always pointed at Israel, and these left-wingers, these bleeding hearts, taking to the streets in these various cities that you mentioned, in countries all over the world, to protest for so-called democracy.
Yeah.
The hell's going on with these guys? They don't see the reality, or they don't want to see the reality, or they don't want you to mention the reality of what kind of neighborhood Israel is in and what is wrong with having a Jewish state.
Yeah. Allow me to throw in a footnote from history. In 1979, in the aftermath of Sadat's visit to Israel, he realized that he could win more through proclaiming peace. Mind you, there was no peace. Proclaiming peace with certain conditions. Of course, the return of all territories, the Sinai, the Rafiach oil wells, and on and on and on. And people seem to forget, because he was lionized in death in 1981, that one of the conditions that he imposed upon Israel for having peace with Egypt was that Jerusalem be under Arab control, and Palestinian Arab control. It was nonsense. In 1979, when this was happening, a brilliant Jewish historian, wonderful writer, once many years before, was secretary to Zev Jabotinsky, South African-born Shmuel Katz. If people have a library of Jewish books, I'm sure they have a very old book of his, Battleground, Shmuel Katz. But Shmuel Katz, in a piece that he wrote in the Jerusalem Post then, referred to the Arab world that you had made mention of, Meir, as every one of them being a one-bullet regime. That's what he referred. He referred to it as a one-bullet regime. He also talked about the fact at the same time, and perhaps it was even in the same article, the fact that the United States was trying to pressure Israel into making concessions in order to bring the Arab world to some conciliatory thing. And Israel, of course, was asked to sacrifice its security. And Shmuel Katz once again came up with a brilliant phrase, turn to the words. He said the United States wasn't really concerned about Israel's future. What the United States president was looking for was a photogenic solution to the Middle East. It was a great guy. It was a photogenic solution to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Well, nothing has really changed. You mentioned about Egypt. Everyone says, well, the peace with Egypt has certainly stood the test of time. No, it didn't. Have people forgotten about Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood? The fact that the American president at the time, Barack, and I don't mean Ehud, Barack Obama, they supported Morsi. They supported the revolution. And Morsi had already announced that he was going to abrogate any normalization of relations with Israel. So this notion, as you said quite astutely, that the Israel is surrounded by these peace-loving nations and what have you, and that Israel can take risks to its future is insanity. It's absolutely insanity. Allow me, if I may also, I like to throw some empirical stuff which gives some weight to the opinions that you and I often state. And I just want to read, just very quickly, a comprehensive study that was done in Israel. It was done exactly 2 months before, 2.5 months before this last election. This was done on August 29th of 2022, a number of months ago. And the headline of this particular piece was Jewish Israeli voters have moved significantly rightward in recent years, data shows. It was a study that was done by the Israel Democracy Institute, and it basically gave the numbers that those people who self-identified as right-wing or leaning strongly right-wing went from the figure, same survey that was done in 2019, had them at 46%. And when the election, well, 2.5 months before the election, it went up from 46% to 62%. So the majority of those Jews in Israel who voted for an ideology, political party, political personalities who they knew represented what others, and I don't like the nomenclature, the right wing. The right wing. What's remarkable is that the middle piece, those that consider themselves centrists, actually dropped also they dropped between 2019 and 2022. In a very short period of time, that middle group dropped from 33% to 24%. And here's the punchline. The left, those who identified themselves as the left in 2019 had once been counted as 17% of the Jewish population. Those who self-professed to vote left. That number fell in that pre-election survey to 11%. So we have now, assuming that there's any measure of accuracy for the numbers that I just gave, we have 11% of Israel's Jewish population, the left, staging these incredible demonstrations, calling Israel an apartheid state and so on and so forth, the end of democracy, civil war, and on and on. And who are they challenging? They're challenging those people who self-identify as right-wing, 62%. And we need to just sort of wake up and realize that this is a joke. It's a sham. However, the left understands how to play the game. They make noise. They call for civil unrest. They call for war. They call for bloodshed. They do exactly what the Arabs do quite frequently. Anytime that the Americans suggest that they're going to support Israel, and I'll give an example that we all know, that the American embassy was going to be moved with Donald Trump from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Yep. All of a sudden, the Arab world was in an uproar, and the Arabs said, if you do this, if you fulfill that promise to Israel and move, there will be World War III.
Right.
And what happened? The liberal left in Israel was upset. And the liberal left, mind you, opposed the move to Jews in Israel who were liberal, opposed the move of Israel's capital to Tel Aviv. And one of the reasons that they cited was, why do we need to do it? And if we do it, it's going to upset the Arabs. So let's not do it. Now, the Arabs, of course, pay attention to this. And as they pay attention, they realize exactly which buttons they need to push in order to get. Our side, and it's tragic because throughout the last many decades of Israel's modern existence, the right wing, which has always been the majority, by the way, in every survey that's ever been done in Israel's history, there's only been one time, and it was for a very, very short period of time. It was for 2 weeks. It was for 2 weeks that a survey was done in which people identified with the liberal left more than they did with the right wing. And those 2 weeks happened to be, and it's understandable, the 2 weeks after the assassination in 1995 of Yitzhak Rabin. In every other survey that has ever been conducted in the last many decades, they lean right. And yet when the right wing is in power, when the right wing, when the traditionalists, when the Zionists, the strong Zionists are in power, when those who say the Jews have a right to settle their own land, where does the opposition come from? It comes from the Jewish liberal left. It's truly, truly disheartening. And as I said before, and as I often say, there's a war going on, and it's a war of ideas. And unless our side stands firm, truly firm, uncompromising, it's a war we're going to lose. We cannot compromise with those who, if they get their way, will truncate Israel territorially and will weaken Israel spiritually and ideologically.
I see too many people who identify on the right watching these protests and saying, we have to reach out to them. We have to be able to speak to them.
Right.
We have to instead of fighting for the truth.
Right.
That's what I see going on.
Right.
And that's a tragedy.
Yeah, it is a tragedy. Meir, I'm sorry, I know you know my style. Can I throw a quote that
Go ahead.
That most of us will remember? In 2005, it was in June of 2005, and for those of us who know history, we remember that June of 2005 was right before August of 2005. when Israel had its unilateral disengagement from Gaza. Okay?
Yep.
We had a government, first with Sharon, and then taken over, it was the two of them, with Ehud Olmert, in which they basically said, by unilaterally disengaging from Gaza, we will accomplish two things. We will give the Arabs no more reason to challenge us because they're now in charge of their own lot, their own future. Gaza will now be Judenrein, free of Jews. 25 communities, Gush Katif, most famous or prominent among them, all evacuated, forcibly evacuated. The Arabs will not have anything to complain about. That was the one element of it. The second element of that unilateral withdrawal was that the world is going to say, look, Israel is so much dedicated to the quest for peace that Europe and all the others are going to fall and support Israel because of this magnanimous gesture on the part of Israel. On June 9th, again, a couple months, 2 months before this unilateral disengagement, speaking to the Israel Policy Forum, at the time, Vice Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who just this week called for bloodshed, okay, he was representing Ariel Sharon, and he said the following sentence, and we'll all remember it, and if we've forgotten it, that's the reason we lose this war of ideology. Here's what he said then. We're tired of fighting. We're tired of being courageous. We're tired of winning. We're tired of defeating our enemies. We want that we will be able to live in an entirely different environment of relations with our enemies. We want them to be our friends, our partners, our good neighbors, and I believe that this is not impossible. I don't know that any more dangerous words were ever spoken, never mind by an Israeli in Israel, from the Communist Party. I don't know that any more dangerous is the word here, words were ever spoken by any of Israel's enemies. We're tired of winning. We're tired of being courageous. We want our enemy to love us. Give them what they want.
I remember a number of spokespeople for Ariel Sharon back then, and they presented this picture, and they had credentials. They're from the right, and the picture that they're painting was that Israel is going to pull out of Gaza. They're going to set up some kind of a moat, some kind of a deep river or something, preventing any infiltration into Israel. It's going to be infested with sharks and you name it. No one's getting into Israel from Gaza. And by the way, Sharon promised that if there's one firing from Gaza, we're just going to level Gaza completely. And you know what? I mean, at the time, and I was thinking, well, Ariel Sharon, I mean, probably his whole idea is, with his history of being quite a warrior and all that, with his history, he probably wants to pull the Jews out temporarily because he wants to just do the job and no one's going to get in his way, and he'll flatten Gaza 1, 2, 3, and then the Jews will go back and live happily ever after. Not at all. Not at all. There was no moat. There were no sharks. There was no.
Ariel Sharon, sad to say, he was in every sense one of the giants of the settler movements. He was a giant. He was one of the forefathers of that entire understanding that the land of Israel, the greater land of Israel. Ariel Sharon, at the end of his career, for reasons which we later came to understand, there was a compromise that he made in order for the Israeli media not to go after him with the corruption that he was doing with the son, with Kern from South Africa and such. What he did, he went into an ideological coma, and then God struck him with a physical coma. And the remarkable thing is, Ariel Sharon, who betrayed everything that he himself believed in, betrayed everything that he believed in, never got to see the consequences of this insane tragedy that he helped create. And that is evidenced by now, mind you, we're talking about 2005, by more than 21,000 rockets that have fallen from Gaza, Jew-free, into Israel. That was the reality of this is what happens when we bend over to try and placate an enemy which is implacable in its determination to destroy us.
It's unreal. I mean, that's the reality of it. And Ehud Olmert, who at one time he was the mayor of Jerusalem, and he was a staunch personality opposing the Oslo Accords, very vocal against the Oslo Accords, seemed to say the right stuff, and yet it's a complete reversal with his personality today, and he's on record calling for bloodshed right now as well. Yeah. He's completely different. He was against President Donald Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem. After the embassy moved, he had a very public news conference with Mahmoud Abbas condemning the moves that President Trump was doing for Israel. And I don't even think a sellout is the word to say for him. I don't even know what the word to say for him is, because at one time he was saying the right things, and all of a sudden it's complete reverse right now, and he's calling for civil war and calling for the death of the Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah. Well, this is Ehud Olmert, who fits into that category that I often find reason to bring up. It's political prostitution is what it is. Yep. What's the irony of the whole Ehud Olmert is not to be taken seriously. In Israel, he has no following in Israel. He's considered today a buffoon, but his buffoonery is in best evidence when he speaks against Bibi Netanyahu. And Ehud Olmert, who most of the people out there listening or watching will remember, spent time in prison for corruption. Okay, Ehud Olmert's favorite way to describe Bibi Netanyahu is he refers to him as that criminal. As we can't have a criminal, he said about 3 months ago, we can't have a criminal as prime minister. And you can't make this up. You just can't make this up. If I may, Mayor, I just want to mention something about, because the basis of what we're talking about, this discussion of a civil war, this civil disobedience, the civil unrest. If it was civil disobedience, God knows in my day as a Jewish activist, and your day as a Jewish activist, I think that people who didn't like us refer to us as Jewish militants. We certainly understand. We certainly understand the place, the value, and the sanctity of dissent. We understand it, of opposing, of being in the opposition. But we never did it in such fashion that it was going to destroy the very thing that we love the most. It's remarkable. If one goes back, they were talking about civil unrest, civil unrest, civil war. Historians will remind us that Menachem Begin, in 1952, in December of 1951, Israel, at the time Ben-Gurion was prime minister, came to terms with West Germany that there would be reparations.
Yep.
And Menachem Begin, whose family suffered, of course, during the Holocaust, he was a Zionist ideologue as one would ever find in Israel's modern history. He was completely against it. And while Israel was working out the negotiations with West Germany, with Konrad Adenauer and such, about Menachem Begin came out and said quite clearly in January of 1952 that to accept money from Germany, and the way it was phrased, and this is very important that people miss. If you go back and look at the speech that he gave, it was a long speech. Purists will say that it was one of the brilliant speeches ever given, perhaps the best ever given by an Israeli politician, the Knesset, and he spoke against getting reparations, and he said that the way that the arrangement was made with then foreign minister Moshe Sharat, it was basically telling the Germans, if you give us reparations, history will forgive you for the atrocities that you committed. And if not, it'll certainly go a long way in showing that you are now the new Germany, not the old Germany. Well, Menachem Begin went crazy, and he called for demonstrations in the street. Once again, let's remember, Israel's population was significantly smaller. It's 10% of what it is today. And in Kikkar Zion, in Zion Square in Jerusalem, he spoke from the balcony of the second floor to 15,000 strong adherents, and he's told them, we will fight this with everything we have. We will fight this with everything we have, which is legitimate ideological parlance. But he would never allow a civil war. When we remembered the discussion of the Altalena, when the Palmach, the Haganah shot the Altalena, which was in June of 1948. So he understood that Israel's future and the destiny of the Jewish people, as you mentioned in the beginning, Meir, about the Jewish element here, he understood that yes, demonstrations of fair play, he called on people to surround the Knesset. At the time, the Knesset was in King George Street. He called for people to demonstrate, not to allow it, not to be forgiven. We don't do this thing because ideologically we're Zionists, we're Jewish, we have our own state. Look what happened to us when we were stateless. We will fight it with everything we have. But there were lines drawn, and he was a big enough man to draw those lines. Those are lines which don't exist for the left, based on what they've been saying in the last 2 weeks. And believe me, reparations and the whole issue of forgiving Nazi Germany was a little closer to an emotional issue then than this nonsense of this judicial reform. What's the issue of judicial reform that the left doesn't like? The fact that there are a couple of elements which basically say that the court today, the way it's structured today, which is the reform that the Bibi government wants to change, it basically says that the left cannot use the Supreme Court, which is strongly left. They can't use it as judicial activists in order to overrule legislation which is passed by a democratically elected Knesset. That ideological framework exists in every Western country. And yet, all these people that we've been speaking about, who've been protesting against Israel, are saying we need to be an example, as are other democracies in the Western world. No democracy in the Western world has rules where its courts can overrule legislation which is passed democratically by democratically elected thing. And what do they use as the punchline? They use this thing called reasonableness. The reasonableness doctrine, which says that the Supreme Court, there is no constitution. There's a basic law which has been added to many times. And what they basically say is whether or not the court, a leftist court, mind you, deems it reasonable. And if they don't deem it reasonable, they actually have the ability to shut down any discussion of a law even before it's passed. This is insanity. One last thing about the courts, which is important. The way that the Supreme Court, the members are chosen, it's a vote of, there are 9 people. I won't go into the details. It's actually quite interesting. The Minister of Justice, 2 Knesset members, and on and on. But the important part here is that there are 9 people who vote to accept the recommendations of the new Supreme Court justices, the ones who will replace those who are stepping down. And 3 of the 9 who vote are present Supreme Court justices.
Right.
In order to be accepted as a Supreme Court justice, you have to have 7 of the 9 votes. 7 of the 9 votes. So if the 3 Supreme Court justices today who are strongly left decide as a bloc, as they do and as they will. They have veto power on anyone, Bibi Netanyahu and his whatever political movement. They want to recommend a Supreme Court justice. It's accepted by the Minister of Justice, because today it's a Likud person, and it doesn't matter because 3 of the 9 are leftist Supreme Court justices. It takes only 2. It takes 3 to veto. They veto every single time. So the present government says that needs to be changed. It needs to be changed. Now, if you presented this as an artificial abstract, in theory, to any to anyone who studies jurisprudence in the Western world, they would tell you it's insane. But the moment you tell them BB and the left and so on and so forth, they go with the left. It's madness, and in this particular case, Israel and its present coalition government dare not capitulate to the demonstrations and the pressures and this barking of the dogs that we hear from prime ministers who were thrown out of office. Ehud Barak, who suffered the greatest defeat percentage-wise of a Jewish vote of any prime minister ever, and Ehud Olmer, who sat in prison for corruption. Okay, and I might as well add, and Benny Gantz, who, when he was chief of staff, admitted that he risked the lives of his own Golani soldiers in order not to have collateral damage when bombing Hamas, because BBC might not like it. These are the 3 loudest voices against the present government. And I don't know how one says in Arabic, give me a break.
Let me add to that, that the left wing as well, they want this to become a major international issue.
Yes.
They're screaming so much, it has to be like this is a world concern. We need to have UN major resolutions and meetings about this. They're saying that this government is going to be responsible for the collapse of the economy. It's going to go downhill, in spite of the reality that Netanyahu was an economic genius for Israel for many, many years. But here's the thing. In terms of it being an international issue, to make it an international issue, the world is concerned about a few things right now at the top of their list. Major earthquakes that occurred. I think there's the count is millions of people affected right now by the earthquakes. It's huge. And the war with Russia and the Ukraine, which doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. The world is preoccupied with that. And by the way, as far as the economy goes, just yesterday it was reported that Israel made their first shipment of oil. So they're exporting oil and gas right now. So, right, exactly. Give me a break.
Yeah. And you're right about one thing, by the way. With the world ostensibly preoccupied elsewhere, let's not forget the Chinese balloons flying over America. Okay, which, by the way, talk about an honest government that the Biden administration wasn't even willing to admit were taking place until a civilian, a normal citizen in Montana, looked up in the sky, took a photo, and it became an issue. The Biden administration was not even willing to admit that the Chinese are doing everything, whatever. This leftist mentality is one which tragically has actually entered Israel. And even though I gave the numbers which show that Israel, that the average person in the street is strongly against the leftists are louder. They are louder. And this is where we lose the game. And we can't afford to. We just can't afford to. And the moment that they realize that we are, when I say we who purvey the ideology that you and I talk about on this podcast, the moment that they see that there's any willingness to compromise. They realize that the louder they bark, the more they're going to get their way. It's tragic. It's truly tragic.
There are historic moments, and the numbers are there on the Jewish right side. And as long as those who are part of that maintain the faith and their convictions and move forward, nothing could get in our way.
Yeah.
Nothing could get in our way. But it is a historic moment. And as you mentioned and explained very well, that the previous government was not a legitimate government at all. And the election campaign that Naftali Bennett ran on, he lied to his voters. I know people personally who voted for him, and they felt completely deceived when he went with Yair Lapid and the extreme, and people like Moshe Ratz. He went with them, and he went with the Muslim Brotherhood as well. So they were completely deceived, and the government did not last long. It fell.
Yeah.
So, you know, we feel good that this government was elected, that it is with religious parties and people such as Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and there's some good people in the Likud party as well, that Israel's on the brink of something really good. And the country is becoming extremely successful. It's what I mentioned, that the oil and gas, we don't even know what the revenue is going to be for that in years to come, but it's certainly going to be amazing. And with the high tech and everything else that Israel has going for it, and the identity, the Jewish identity, to really be an example to the Jewish people and to the world. You know, these Islamic countries, they're not an example of any kind of values at all, and they just butcher people. We'll see a country that they could be proud of, a Jewish state that stands for proper values and proper norms and proper morality, and is successful. We're almost reaching the hour. Meir, final comments, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you. When I've done this before, you've asked me always for a final comment. I appreciate it. I'm actually going to pull something out that in one of my, might have been the first time that I shared a microphone with you. It was certainly a while ago that I read a very small piece, which I would like to do again, because it's certainly relevant to what we're talking about. And with your permission, one day in the future, when we speak again on this, I'm going to read it again because it's that relevant. It's on the last page of a book that was written 99 years ago by Maurice Samuels. Maurice Samuels was a prolific writer and often spoke about Jewish affairs. He wrote this in a book called You Gentiles, in which he was basically saying that the Jews at the time, mind you, stateless, often persecuted, needed to stop apologizing for their existence. And on that last page of that book, it's a wonderful book, he wrote this page, which he titled A Last Word. It's only 3 or 4 paragraphs. I'm only going to read you the last paragraph because it's ever so important now. Here's what he said at the very, very end of his book, explaining why he wrote the book. And he said, I believe that though I might have erred here and there, I've been mainly right. And I console myself with the thought that if this book offends by its assertiveness, God knows that the infinite tactfulness of thousands of other Jews seems to have offended no less. Whatever we do, we are damned. And I would rather be damned standing up than lying down.
Amen. Absolutely. Well put.
Yeah.
Well, it's like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
How prophetic.
Anyhow, so thank you for
words.
the invitation once again, and we'll do it again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Meir, for joining us, and thank you for everyone who was watching. If you could please share this with the various platforms that you use, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp groups. We'll appreciate it. We'll get the word out. And as always, we continue. Thank you very much for joining us. And if you would like to assist in any way, volunteer, or you want to make a donation, go to our website, israelnow.ca. We'd appreciate it. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom.